Temple women of Mesopotamia, the shocking truth you must see. Imagine this. You step through a doorway in time and find yourself in the city of Ur, 2,300 years before Christ. The desert sun warms your face, the air smells of clay and smoke, and right in front of you, a little girl, no older than 10, is led by priests toward the great temple. The crowd whispers, "She's blessed by the gods," but you see something different. In this journey, we'll uncover the hidden truth behind that blessing, why entire families surrendered their children, and how, if you carried today's wisdom, you could have changed everything. From building community grain banks to teaching secret schools by lamplight, this isn't just history, it's a mirror. Because if you can spot injustice in the past, maybe you'll see the patterns that still surround us today. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find the courage to change them. 1. The dark reality behind divine service. When you first arrive in Ur, the ancient jewel of Mesopotamia, it feels almost magical. Towering ziggurats reach for the heavens, bustling markets fill the air with voices, and the Euphrates shimmers like a silver ribbon cutting through the desert. To the casual traveler, it looks like the dawn of civilization, order, beauty, and faith. But walk a little closer to the temple gates, and the glow fades. You see families leading their children by the hand, their faces tight with worry. A girl with hair neatly braided is being handed over to the priests. Her mother whispers a blessing, trying to hide the tears in her eyes. The crowd murmurs, "She has been chosen by the gods." At first, you might think this is honor, a spiritual calling. But from your modern perspective, the truth hits hard. This isn't divine destiny, it's survival economics. Families drowning in debt or hunger often had no choice but to gift their daughters to the temple. Inside those stone walls, divine service rarely meant chanting prayers or writing hymns. More often, it meant a life of obedience, control, and in many cases, exploitation. Children became laborers for temple estates, or worse, symbols used to reinforce the power of the priestly elite. Think about it this way. Imagine a struggling American family in the early 1900s, forced to send their child to a factory to put food on the table. They might tell themselves, "It's work, it's honorable, it's what we must do." That's exactly what parents in Ur were doing, wrapping desperation in the language of faith. And here's the heartbreaking part. Once a child entered temple service, she no longer belonged to her family. She belonged to the gods, or more precisely, to the men who claimed to speak for them. A sacred promise, yes, but also a chain. Now, it would be easy to judge these families, but pause for a second. Put yourself in their sandals. You live in a world where one bad harvest could wipe out everything. Grain runs out, debts pile up, disease stalks your household. In that reality, giving up a daughter to the temple might feel like the only way to protect the rest of your children. This is what makes the system so powerful. It wrapped exploitation inside the language of devotion. And once something is labeled sacred, it's almost impossible to question. Here's a small lesson we can take home today. Whenever you hear that a practice is just tradition, or the way it's always been, it's worth asking who benefits from this and who pays the price. Because history shows us that injustice often hides behind the mask of normal. For the people of Ur, temple service was sold as a blessing. But for the children, it was often a stolen childhood. For the parents, it was a sacrifice born not of faith, but of poverty. And for the priests, it was a system that gave them labor, loyalty, and untouchable authority. If you're standing there as a time traveler, watching this unfold, you know something the crowd doesn't. Change is possible. You've seen societies where faith and freedom can coexist. You've seen families supported by community instead of stripped apart by it. And the thought rises inside you, what if you could rewrite this story? Because here's the twist. You don't have to accept the temple's rules. You have the advantage of modern knowledge, of centuries of hindsight. And with that, you begin to ask, if the root problem is economic desperation, what would happen if families had another way to survive? That question leads us directly into the next part of our journey, your revolutionary playbook. How you Standing there in 2300 BCE with nothing but your wits and modern perspective could plant the seeds of reform that might change the fate of generations. 2. Your revolutionary playbook, how you'd fight back in 2300 BCE. So here you are, standing in Ur, heart heavy, after watching children disappear into temple gates. The question isn't what's wrong anymore. You know that. The question is, what could you actually do about it? The good news is, you don't need iPhones or modern banks to spark change. You only need ideas, ones already possible with the tools of the time. Step 1. Economic liberation. Instead of credit unions, you'd start with something they already understood: grain banks. Imagine neighbors pooling barley after a good harvest, stored safely in clay jars. Families could borrow during lean months and pay back after the next harvest. Suddenly, parents had another choice, besides handing their daughters to the temple. History shows similar systems in later civilizations. Egyptian granaries, Greek grain stores that literally kept people alive. Step 2. Education as quiet resistance. Next, you'd gather a small circle of temple workers after dark, maybe in a side chamber lit by oil lamps. On clay tablets, you'd sketch cuneiform signs, teaching not just letters, but also numbers, contracts, and record-keeping. Reading and writing were superpowers in that world. And once women could understand contracts, they were no longer invisible. This mirrors what enslaved people in America did centuries ago, secretly learning to read, even when it was forbidden, because knowledge was freedom. Step 3. Theology reframed. Of course, you couldn't just talk economics and literacy. The priests held power through the gods, so you'd need to speak that language too. You'd remind people of Inanna, the fierce goddess who protected women, or Shamash, the god of justice. If the gods care about justice, then surely they don't demand the suffering of children. By using their own beliefs, you turn resistance into devotion. And here's the small lesson for us. Reform never works if you attack a system head on with foreign ideas. Real change comes when you translate new values into a language the culture already trusts. Now, standing in the flicker of torchlight, with grain jars filling up, women learning to write, and whispers of a gentler theology spreading, you realize you've started something bigger than yourself. But will it last? That's where we step into the ripple effect of your choices. 3. The ripple effect. How one change could rewrite history and your present. Picture this. It's a generation later. The temple gates still stand, but the story has shifted. Families now turn to grain banks instead of surrendering daughters. Inside the temple, women read and write, keeping records, teaching others. Priests no longer hold absolute power. They share it with scribes, merchants, and even mothers who once had no voice. That single spark, economic alternatives, secret schools, reframed theology has rippled outward. By the time Hammurabi's laws appear, women's rights are stronger, families more secure, and faith less about fear and more about justice. History itself bends, all because someone dared to ask, what if we did it differently? Of course, not every story ends in triumph. Maybe your movement would collapse under resistance. Maybe you'd be cast out, punished for challenging the gods. But even failure plants seeds. Think about America's own history: abolitionists, suffragettes, civil rights leaders. Many were silenced in their time, yet their courage prepared the ground for change. Here's the lesson for us today. The past proves injustice is never destiny. Systems only look permanent until someone begins to question them. And that power, to see clearly, to act bravely, belongs to each of us right now. So let me leave you with this. If you had the chance to change one injustice in history, what would it be? And even more important, what injustice in our world will you choose to challenge today? Because maybe you don't need a time machine at all. If this journey through ancient Mesopotamia opened your eyes, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next adventure, where we'll step into another corner of history and ask, what could we change if we were there? I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, what injustice in history would you rewrite if you had the chance? Your perspective might inspire someone else watching right now. Together, we're not just studying history, we're learning how to change the present.